Thanks, Sam. So this presentation will be speculative, firstly because I'm no expert on Chinese literature, secondly because the theoretical frames I'll be engaging with are complex, and finally because of the nature of the event and the asking of questions rather than solving problems. So I've included two items on the reading list for this event. The first is a presentation I delivered at the 4th China-Australia Literary Forum and concerns the concept of intuition. The second is a short supplementary essay by the German philosopher Hans-Georg Gadamer from Truth and Method, called To What Extent Does Language Perform Thought? In preparing for this paper, I became interested in the problem of the universal, the problem as to whether it's in any way possible within the field of world literature to develop concepts or theoretical frames which might be thought to be generally applicable between different cultures, with quite different traditions, such as China and the West. I chose Gadamer as an example text to consider this problem. Gadamer begins his essay by pointing with some trepidation to the moment of cultural crisis he sees himself living through. Although Gadamer was writing this piece way back in the 1970s, the crisis he describes sounds very much like our own crisis. It's a crisis that involves rampant capitalism threatening to consume the world. It's a crisis that involves technology moving us not towards an ongoing human emancipation and progress, but rather towards potential destruction. Gadamer imagines in describing this crisis that if everything continues as it is in that world, or that the world, or human civilization at least, will come to an end. So Gadamer's world is no longer our world exactly, and it's likely that he was not thinking of global warming and environmental degradation such as we know it now, but more of nuclear war and the ongoing tensions of the Cold War. Still, the opening sections of the essay resonate, to go back to the term that came up yesterday. What's troubling in Gadamer's reading is the idea of this spiralling towards annihilation, a death spiral which for him seems already to have begun. What's troubling is that this is linked to the central idea of language and how it frames and informs everything we do. This frame of language in turn is linked specifically to Western culture, beginning with the Greeks. All Western philosophy is built upon the structure of Western thought, which is in turn built upon the structure of language. Gadamer claims, quote, "We see with increasing clarity today, as Heidegger especially has taught us to see, that Greek metaphysics is the beginning of modern technology," end quote. And this technology in turn has in large part brought about the spiralling towards destruction I mentioned. Gadamer talks of the universal in two ways. One way seems potentially positive, and the other, which tends to swamp the first in this essay, is negative. Both relate to the potentials and limits of language. On the positive side, he sees understanding and speaking as universal things, claiming that language is not only ideology, that it is not only a matter of recycling received opinions or worldviews, that rather, quote, "there are no limits to the interior dialogue of the soul with itself," end quote. That is, in seeking understanding of ourselves through language, we move beyond the limits of ideology. He further claims that, quote, "the act of understanding and speaking has a claim to universality. We can express everything in words and can try to come to agreement about everything," end quote. That is, in seeking understanding of others through language, we negotiate between the received opinions that are maintained within and between each cultural tradition. What Gadamer doesn't really address in this particular paper is the power of language to maintain and transmit traditions, although he does talk about this elsewhere. And this is indeed one of language's primary capacities, as Alexis Wright and Xie Xuan and others have shown yesterday. Perhaps the pessimism of his argument here takes him away from this, though outlines of it appear in the more upbeat ending of the essay, where Gadamer talks of the power of writing and translation. Here he describes a process of creation through which, in an intuitive way, one is led by the associations language brings with it to express something one did not necessarily expect to express when one began to write. In Sydney recently, this year's writer-in-residence to this project, Pedro Mayoral from Argentina, spoke of the writing process as sleepwalking. This process draws upon the logics and understandings that attach themselves to language. Yet writing also plays with the meanings of words, so that those words are never simple ideology. Rather, it draws attention to the process of understanding. Yet Gadamer quickly turns towards the negative, to what limits our capacity to respond. This too involves language, as everything that involves thought does in Gadamer's system. He describes a process of creation through which, in an intuitive way, one is led by the associations language brings with it to express something one did not necessarily expect to express when one began to write. Here he describes a process of creation through which, in an intuitive way, one is led by the associations language brings with it to express something one did not necessarily expect to express when one began to write. He waters down the positive claims by indicating that the conversations, both with ourselves and with others, in order to work out, in order to truly lead to understanding, would have to be infinite. This, he claims, is self-evident. His main concern, though, is as follows, quote, "Does not a whole series of opposing arguments arise against the universality of our linguistically mediated experience of the world?" End quote. He alludes here to what he calls American relativism, by which I understand the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which is that what we are able to think is determined by the languages we exist within, and so we're necessarily limited. Gadamer underlines too that what was once Western culture, Western technology, has itself become or made itself universal, so that the disease it allegedly carries within it, within its metaphysics, within the logic of its languages, which is causing us to spiral towards crisis, has been exported and spread all over the world. Within this, there is an idea of the central framing role of language. Gadamer was a proponent of what has come to be called the linguistic turn, where, to speak very roughly, language has been equated with or identified with thought. The linguistic turn, if pushed to an extreme, carried with it a kind of vicious circle. If who and what we are is predetermined by the language or discourses that form us, how can we ever escape from these discourses? How could we hope to get outside them or find the truth that they might hide from us? Which I think is kind of Foucault's problem in part. So nowadays there's been a shift away from the idea that thought is identical with language. Why? Partly through exhaustion with the rigours of the theories that address these problems and its aporias. Partly through counter-theories that see communication and understanding not just in human language, but in relations of all kinds, including non-human relations and non-linguistically mediated human relations. Partly through a turn to cognitive science regarding matters of thought, which has claimed the importance of feeling and non-linguistic responses, and is focused on the brain rather than language alone. I wanted to turn to some questions, some large questions. So are Gadamer's problems the problems we see now? Are Western traditions expanding or stretching in some ways through globalization? What problems has the mixing of Western traditions with other non-Western traditions brought with it? Is contemporary literature party to this process of globalization, with particular forms of expression being propagated throughout the world due to their value in the market rather than their value as ideas? If so, what are the implications of this? If we have moved on from the vicious circle of language, are we now liberated from the problem that discourse and ideology determines what we can say? So tentatively, I want to make some assertions regarding our power to understand. I wanted to argue that we are free of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis because it's always been based on overstatement, but that it also has always carried with it some element of the truth. So we can and do understand outside of language and traditions through perpetual responses, but also through interpretation. In saying this, in effect, although I would use different touchstones to Gadamer, mine being Spinoza and Deleuze in particular, I'm more or less echoing what he has said about understanding. Understanding following Spinoza is not a purely linguistic matter. Intuition is what allows us to begin to think. It is also that which allows us to understand. Part of Spinoza's logic can be traced back to the ancient Greek Stoics. For the Stoics, words and writing are material things. They are bodies. But the meanings of words and written signs are not bodies. Rather, the meanings are attributed to the words. Meaning itself is incorporeal. Spinoza insists upon the immaterial nature of understanding. For Spinoza, the idea, or that which is meaningful, cannot be identified with words or images. Rather, the idea is the very act of understanding, the feeling we get when we understand something. So we can find understanding emerging between or among words and images, but the meanings we feel are not identical with those words or images. This makes translation possible, as what needs to be conveyed is the relation of ideas. What needs to be conveyed is the relation of understandings, which of course remains very difficult, as we saw yesterday. This is something that Gadamer too sees. So quoting from Gadamer, "The translation process fundamentally contains the whole secret of how human beings communicate with each other. Translation is an indissoluble unity of implicit acts of anticipating, of grasping meaning as a whole beforehand, explicitly laying down what is thus grasped in advance. So this is a kind of definition of intuition, I think, although he doesn't use those terms. Spinoza also explains the power of misunderstanding in art. When we misunderstand for Spinoza, it is not because we cannot grasp a particular idea. Rather, it is because we associate the wrong ideas, the wrong contexts, with the words on the page. Cultures bring their own contexts, their own ways of associating ideas. So when they talk with each other, they will often attribute different meanings to the same words or the substituted words available to translation. This can lead to misunderstanding, but it also opens the possibilities of a new richness of meaning, of new insights and understandings. I do think there is an argument to be made for the new universal status of intuition, one not built on language, but on the nature of the human body and its capacities of perception, and the human mind and its capacities of understanding, which is shared equally amongst all peoples. At the China-Australia Literary Forum 4, the Chinese scholar Ji Yushan, who followed my paper, claimed that the concept of intuition I described resonated strongly with ideas from Taoism, and the notion of the principle in particular, something he felt was crucial within the traditions of Chinese literature. So this is not something I know about or can explore here, though interestingly it was Taoism was brought up quite a bit yesterday. But I note that Douglas Robinson has recently used concepts from Tao to attempt to explore the potentials for translation between Eastern and Western traditions and literatures. Yet paradoxically, we also escape the vicious circle of ideology language through misunderstandings and the potential of new understandings that open up. To quote Samuel Beckett, "Dear incomprehension, it's thanks to you I'll be myself in the end." This answers the assertion that a global literature is emerging which flattens the resistance of local interpretations. Rather, insofar as local traditions encounter global universalizing concepts, it might be argued that they are capable of misunderstanding them, building new interpretations which retain the particular flavour of the local understandings. Yet this still doesn't answer the pessimism of Gadamer's essay, which seems very modern. While there must be a potential to open a way of understanding which claims alternative truth within the heart of global capitalism, a thinking outside of global capitalism seems as difficult as it ever has been. So what of Chinese literature? An article written by Xie Xuan called "Chinese as a Language in a Neighbourhood" argues that Chinese literature is in the process of reinventing itself, repositioning itself in relation to its changing circumstances. Here, an ancient tradition might make use of Western forms and deform and manipulate those forms in an effort to do justice both to the rich ancient traditions of understanding from Chinese culture and to what is emerging now in the contemporary global world. This allows a different relation to traditions, which resembles Gadamer's idea of conversation. Minor literature, like Latin American fiction, like Aboriginal fiction, like Australian literature, literatures of the South, also can come to challenge the dominant traditions. But it's no longer just a matter of tradition. Rather, the global crisis, a species of which Gadamer already saw, has now, in a sense, become universal, bringing with it a logic which could be called a logic of annihilation. This is a logic which has to be confronted one way or another. It can be confronted by being denied, shutting down understanding, as powerful voices are attempting to do. Yet if one attempts to understand now, if one attempts to write now, some aspect of this universal crisis must emerge. It is a crisis not just of the planet and its resources, but of meaning. To return to China, while there are experiences that are particular to China, rapid change and the challenges these pose, they carry resonances that are meaningful to people everywhere, since change, disruption, is everywhere. Our situation is one of a process of rapid change leading to potential crisis. And the problems are how to confront and overcome crisis. And they are, in some senses, becoming universal.